Everyone wants to build muscle, but most people have no idea how to actually structure their training for hypertrophy. They kind of just go to the gym, do random exercises, chase a pump, and they hope for the best. So today I'm actually going to break down the science of proper hypertrophy programming. Okay, so what is muscle actually made of? So muscle is connected to a bone, and that bone is connected to a tendon, and then you'll have the actual muscle body itself. Within the muscle is going to be the fascicle, and you have the fiber, the myofibril, the sarcomere, and within the sarcomere is the actin and myosin. So the actin is the one that will be moving. The myosin doesn't move at all. So there you go. Before we start talking about programming and everything, we'll actually talk about what triggers muscle growth. So we have mechanical tension. So it's going to be the force of the muscle from the actin and myosin cross bridging. So that when you're lifting a heavy weight, it's that tension experience on those actin and myosin that is experienced by when you're, for example, when you're bench pressing that weight that gravity is pushing down on that actin myosin. The cell membrane is going to detect the tension. It's going to trigger the mTOR pathway, which is just a muscle building pathway. And then protein synthesis is going to occur. So it's going to be maximized with heavy loads and controlled eccentrics. That's kind of the main thing. And mechanical tension is the main driver of hypertrophy. That's kind of the key takeaway here. Then you have metabolic stress. So metabolic stress, of course, we got the guys from Diamond Gym here because these guys are the kings of metabolic stress. They're just doing like crazy stuff. Metabolic stress is going to be the buildup of hydrogen ions and calcium inside the cell. So essentially, it's kind of that burning feeling that you feel in your muscles when you're doing like high reps or whatever. That's not actually lactic acid, it's hydrogen ions. Not that it matters too much, but there you go. And this is going to contribute to growth via the cellular swelling and signaling. So it's more of a secondary contributor, it's not the main driver. We kind of have rep ranges. This is a very popular topic. So here's what most people kind of get wrong. I've been seeing this a lot more with kind of like younger science-based lifters is like they're doing 1 to 3 reps, 1 to 4 reps. And essentially like, yes, you will get more mechanical tension through that way because you are triggering those high threshold motor units or muscle fibers right away. But the thing is that you're not going to build up as much volume, right? So that's the thing. When you do reps of 1 to 4, comparing that to doing reps of 6 to 12, you won't build up as much volume. That's a big thing. So that's just a huge thing is you have to understand volume is the main driver here for hypertrophy and training to failure. And as well, if you train with those really low reps, it's a little bit harder on your joints and things like that. Now, I'm a power lifter. I train in those low rep ranges. I'm not fear mongering, but you have to be very aware that if you do train lower reps, it is going to have a bit of a heavier effect on those tendons and ligaments. And then high reps from 13 to 20 plus, they kind of build muscle primarily through that metabolic stress we were talking about, and you're going to be accumulating metabolites and creating more cellular swelling. So the good thing is kind of we've talked about the low rep ranges and the higher rep ranges. The one problem with the high rep ranges I didn't kind of touch upon was you won't get as much mechanical tension. So that's why people have always kind of said the 6 to 12 range gives you a good mix of both. It's kind of the default recommendation for decades, really. But remember, all rep ranges can stimulate hypertrophy. It's a bit nuanced, obviously. You know, if you want to stimulate hypertrophy, but maybe you're an endurance athlete, you know, maybe go with those higher rep ranges. It might be more specific to your sport. If there's one variable that matters the most, more than anything else for hypertrophy, it's going to be your training to failure is actually number one. But when it also the secondary to that is going to be volume. So total training volume, sets times reps times load per muscle group per week. It has a dose response relationship with muscle growth. More volume within a range generally equals more muscle growth, up to a point, obviously, right? The current evidence kind of suggests about 10 to 20 hard sets per muscle group per week. That's kind of the sweet spot. Anything below 10, you're not providing enough stimulus, and anything above 20, you just start running into a wall. And big thing here is that junk volume doesn't count. Those really like RP6 or reps in reserve, 3 reps, 4 rep sets, they're not effective at all. You got to train to failure. That's the main thing there. Another thing too is training frequency. So 2 times per week is going to be better than 1 time per week. So when volume is equated, hitting a muscle twice per week is going to establish more growth than once per week. They haven't really seen if 3 times a week is better as compared to most of the research, but definitely twice a week is way better than once a week. Why is twice a week better? So muscle protein synthesis is going to peak and return around baseline to within 48 to 72 hours. So if you can stimulate muscle protein synthesis after 72 hours of training, why not try to do it as frequently as you can within a recoverable timeline? That's a big factor there, right? So why stimulate it once a week when you can stimulate it twice a week, right? That's a big major thing. And then kind of also when you do it twice a week, you get to spread that volume out across the session. So you can kind of reduce the volume within that one session and you can really have good movement quality, good technique without kind of, as you get to halfway to the session, towards the end of the session, your movement quality just goes down so much and you're just doing these kind of half-ass sets. All right, so full body versus split, what's better? So full body is going to allow you to have higher frequency per muscle, lower volume per session, more muscle protein synthesis spikes per week. Can't get that one off my tongue there. And it's going to be better for beginners and people who don't have as much time. Why is it better for beginners? It's going to be better for beginners because being able to practice the technique 3 times a week is going to be a lot better, and it's going to allow them to have more practice with the movement, which is very important. So that's a big thing too, is understanding if they can practice that movement more, it's going to allow them to have better sessions. That's a huge factor. A split program is for a bit more intermediate to advanced. So split could be in anything from upper lower to push-pull legs to like a shoulders, arms, chest, whatever it is. So you're going to have higher volume per muscle per session, more exercise variety per muscle groups, and you're going to have greater fatigue and metabolic stress per session. That's why it's recommended for that more intermediate and up category. With full body split, you're not going to be able to get that isolation work as much. So if you're trying to bring up weak points, for example, you're trying to bring up your biceps, you're trying to bring up your forearms or triceps, you won't have as much time to focus on the isolation work, which I find is very important if you're trying to bring up weak points. All right, now we're getting into the good stuff here. So hypertrophy techniques. So these are kind of ways that we can, instead of doing straight sets, kind of once you've, got out of that beginner phase, starting to kind of get into that intermediate, you start plateauing maybe a little bit. There's kind of some techniques that we can use to make sure we can just maybe elicit a little bit more hypertrophy. So drop sets, we've heard of these before. You're going to hit your target reps, and then once you kind of hit whatever 8 reps it is, then you're going to drop the load by 20 to 30%. Do that 8 reps again, and then if you want, you can drop the load by 20-30% again. This is going to accumulate more metabolic stress, so it's kind of more that metabolic stress side of hypertrophy. Here's a paired set. So paired set is when you pair 2 exercises for the same muscle group back to back. You can do a compound plus an isolation. That's kind of the ideal way to do it. Myo reps. So myo reps are just basically a rest pause training method where you do one set very close to failure. You're going to rest briefly, maybe for about 20 to 30 seconds, then perform a smaller mini set after that small break. So for example, you do a set of 8, you're fairly close to failure there, and then after that you rack the weight. You wait about 20 to 30 seconds, then you try to see how many reps you can get after, maybe 3, 4, however it may be. Another hypertrophy technique here is lengthen partials. So kind of after reaching failure, doing your full range of motion, what you can do is you kind of lengthen the full way. For example, if you do a row, and then you're kind of doing these kind of partial repetitions, maybe doing halfway. Then you can even, once you get halfway and you finally hit failure halfway, then you can even do quarter way reps. So another kind of technique that you can use. So here we got paused reps here. So what paused reps are going to do is going to eliminate the stretch shortening cycle at the bottom of the rep. Stretch shortening cycle, just a fancy word to kind of talk about how tendons have kind of this elastic recoil like a rubber band. It will just kind of stretch and then it will snap back, and that's going to help aid you and assist you to kind of get the weight up first. Think about it like this. If you were to do a jump from just a squatting position, so you just hold a squat for about 4 or 5 seconds, then jump up, versus if you're just to kind of come down from the standing position, come down and just come up right away, using a little bit of that elastic energy, you'll be able to jump higher with that elastic energy and that counter movement jump versus kind of doing this sit down for 4 or 5 seconds, then jump up. So you should actually kind of be training your reps like this most of the time anyways. You don't want to be bouncing, especially with bench press. I find people they just bounce it off their chest and they're like, oh, bench press is a terrible exercise for your chest growth. It's just that you don't understand that you're using a lot of elastic energy to try and get you out of that bottom position. So that's where things like pause reps are really effective at for hypertrophy. Yeah, extra range of motion movements. These are really, really beneficial. So exercises that load the muscle through a greater range of motion than kind of the standard exercise. So for example, instead of doing a deadlift, you do a deficit deadlift. Instead of doing a regular barbell bench press, you get a cambered bar bench press and you go to a deeper range of motion. And then here we have force eccentrics. So force eccentrics allow you to load the muscle beyond what you can concentrically lift, kind of producing this super maximal mechanical tension. But you can either do this where you're doing you're doing it where you just load a heavy weight up and then you just kind of let it drop down nice and not drop, but let it come down nice and slow. Then you have a spotter lift it up for you and then you redo it all again. You can do this after you've, for example, if you're doing bench press and then you've hit your, your last rep, you've hit failure, and then you can have a partner just spot you for kind of those eccentrics and then they lift the bar back up. Spot you, right? Bring the bar down by yourself, they lift it back up for you. You can do it that way where you go to concentric failure, or you could just kind of right off the bat just load up a really heavy weight, lower it down, have the spotter lift it up for you. So it's kind of your choice of what you want to do there. The common thing is typically to go to concentric failure and then have the spotter just help you up a little bit. Overload for hypertrophy. So you have to do more over time. You can't just not get better and not get stronger over time or not improve your work capacity over time. You're going to have to overload if you want to have a stimulus eventually. So we kind of have the basics here. We have add weight, self-explanatory, add reps, add sets. These are the very, very common things that are mostly used all the time, but there's other things that we can do other than adding weight, adding reps, adding sets. We can slow down the tempo, which can be very effective. So even without even adding weight or adding reps, if you're bench pressing, I'm going to use bench the whole time during this whole video, but if you're bench pressing, for example, week 1, you do a 2-second eccentric. Then you go week 2, you do a 3-second eccentric. Week 3, you do a 4-second eccentric, and you kind of keep adding on to that. That's another way that you can progressively overload. And then we have the second one here, second slide on this. Another thing you can do is reduce the rest period. So this is going to accumulate a lot more metabolic stress. You will get more of a metabolic adaptation from that. So reducing the rest period. And then number 6 would be adding range of motion. So you can add a longer range of motion. We have this slide over here. So hypertrophy is kind of this gap. So even for powerlifting, it's not just about bodybuilding here where everyone is like, most of you guys are all in the gym trying to get bigger and that's your main goal. But even for powerlifters, it's actually really important that they have some hypertrophy training in there as a gap. So you can have kind of your muscular endurance GPP cycle, then you have your hypertrophy training cycle, and then you have your max strength cycle. This is going to serve as this kind of bridging and gap, because if you don't have a bridge between doing sets of 15 to just going into doing sets of 3, you're going to probably get injured because you haven't created those adaptations that are conducive to hypertrophy and conducive to help you with your max strength. Okay, and this is kind of a debated subject here. So periodization for hypertrophy. Do we need to periodize our training for hypertrophy? I'd say if you're a beginner to even novice, even to early intermediate, there's probably no need to do that. Just focus on basically getting stronger and just focus on adding weight on the bar, progressively overloading until that stimulus doesn't become effective anymore. But it's going to depend on the individual. You don't really need sophisticated programming for an individual who's just a beginner. Like they don't really need to even really train to failure. They can make gains off of just not training to failure. But as an advanced lifter, you're going to need a more strategic approach that's going to allow you to kind of manipulate volume, intensity, and effort, and all these different things. So I'm going to credit Christian Thibodeau. He's a Canadian strength coach, and he kind of created this good model for periodization for hypertrophy. He just talked about it on a podcast. I know it's not a peer-reviewed journal article or anything like that, but I thought that this was very beneficial. So think about this. With phase 1, it's going to be effort-based. So you're going to learn how to train to failure and beyond. So training to failure and beyond, beyond would mean is maybe you're doing those negatives I talked about, or you're doing things like forced reps, or you're doing like, for example, partial reps, things like that. So that's kind of phase 1, teaching you how to train to failure. So that way you know where your limit is and you know how to get there. Because failure and volume are those, if you take anything away from this video, it's failure, going to failure and training volume are the major things there that contribute to hypertrophy. Phase 2, we have volume. So you're going to, once you learn kind of how to train to failure and have really hard effort in the gym, what you're going to do is that you're going to kind of learn how to accumulate some more volume. So doing things like supersets, giant sets, or compound sets, this is going to help build that work capacity. So you build up this really good work capacity once you've learned how to train to failure. And then you go to phase 3, which is kind of more load based. So you'll actually keep the same volume, but you use higher loads to build strength. So how would you keep the same volume, but then use higher loads to build strength? Well, for example, in the volume phase, if you did 8 reps by 3 sets, then that load-based phase would be 3 reps by 8 sets. So that's kind of the idea there, is you're getting more of that load-based volume or load-based stimulus. And the big thing too is that you kind of have this concept of myofibular hypertrophy versus sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. sometimes it's kind of, this is more anecdotal, but you'll see with powerlifters and even some strongmen like Mariusz Pudzianowski, for example, like the muscle density and the hardness of the muscle, it just looks different than as opposed to maybe some bodybuilders where I don't want to say they look softer, but it just there's a hardness that comes with training with those low reps. Here we just have some realistic muscle gain expectations. So about 40 to 50 pounds over your lifetime is kind of a general expectation for most people. It can vary a bit lower, it can vary a bit higher depending on your genetics. And for females, it can actually be roughly about half to a quarter of that 40 to 50 pounds. So for males here, we can think about year 1, you could expect to gain about 20 pounds of muscle. Year 2, about 10 pounds. Year 3, maybe 5 pounds of muscle a year. And kind of as you kind of keep progressing and going along, then you'll kind of see maybe it might not be as much as even 5 pounds, maybe 2, 3, 4 pounds, whatever it may be. That's why kind of obviously you don't need to hop on steroids your first year of training because you're already going to gain so much already. So for fat-free mass index of 25, that's kind of the natural ceiling for most males. Anything that kind of goes above that, you can maybe start expecting that this person might be on some gear. That's kind of the main thing. A male at 190 pounds of lean body mass with about 10% body fat, that would be in the top 5% of the population. So that's like a really high level. If you're at that level, that's a good indicator. Here we just kind of have a chart of fat-free mass indexes examples here. So as you can see, we got Phil Heath. He's the major outlier here, Mr. Olympia. He's at a fat-free mass index of 35. Yeah, that's what it says on the chart there. And you can see that kind of once you can start getting above 25, you should be suspicious. Anything above 27 is like, okay, there's no way you're not on gear. It is possible that you could be at 27, but you're looking at the 0.001% of people. Like, it's just so rare that most of the time you can tell that people are bullshitting you. And the fact that everyone on Instagram, you know, has that higher percentage or higher FFMI of over 27. Come on now, not everyone in the world is the genetic outlier here. So, and then key takeaways here. So mechanical tension is going to be the primary driver of growth. It's not going to be the pump. All rep ranges are going to build muscle through these different mechanisms. So you have kind of these more, you know, mechanical tension versus the metabolic stress mechanisms, but understanding too that most of you guys are going to benefit from that 6 to 12 rep range. Now, if that rep range starts getting a little bit more stagnant, or if your stimulus isn't as effective with that, then maybe it's time to change up the rep range a little bit. There's nothing wrong in trying to change things up if nothing's working, right? Volume is the king. Like 10 to 20 hard sets per muscle group, that's going to be beneficial for you. How are you going to know if it's 10 sets for you versus how are you going to know if it's 20 sets for you? You're going to have to play around with it, right? That's the biggest thing. And a lot of you guys might be 13 sets, 16 sets. Play around a little bit. You got to experiment a little bit with your training as well. Not everything is just, this is black and white. You got to experiment a tiny bit. And train each muscle group at least twice per week. I think that's a big one there. Trying to stimulate muscle protein synthesis at least twice a week is super important. Why would you stimulate it once a week when you can stimulate it twice per week? And then, okay, with that mentality, would you stimulate it 3 times per week? The evidence, we don't really know if it is more beneficial doing it 3 times versus 2. And progressive overload is non-negotiable. And understanding that progressive overload doesn't just have to be adding weights, reps, and sets. You can progressively overload with those methods I talked about as well in that last progressive overload slide. And a major takeaway here, just be patient. Muscle gain is a very slow process, and social media is going to lie to you. A lot of times you'll have people on social media saying, I gained 30 pounds of muscle, 20 pounds of muscle in 6 months, and they're already at an intermediate level or whatever it is. They're lying to you. They're definitely on gear, and they're just trying to sell you some type of program or coaching thing that is going to try and make them money. So people will take steroids and lie to make money. Trust me, they will do it. Hopefully you could have learned something from that today. And if you guys want, apply for coaching. Make sure to like and subscribe. Follow my Instagram, all that good stuff. Have a good rest of your day, guys.